Chapter 9 of Greenmantle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, June 2007. Greenmantle by John Buchan. Chapter 9. The Return of the Straggler. Before I turned in that evening I had done some good hours' work in the engine room. The boat was oil-fired and in very fair order, so my duties did not look as if they would be heavy. There was nobody who could be properly called an engineer, only, besides the furnacemen, a couple of lads from Hamburg, who had been a year ago apprentices in the shipbuilding yard. They were civil fellows, both of them consumptive, who did what I told them and said little. By bedtime, if you had seen me in my blue jumper, a pair of carpet slippers, and a flat cap, all the property of the deceased Walter, you would have sworn I had been bred to the firing of river boats, whereas I had acquired most of my knowledge on one run down the Zambesi, when the proper engineer got drunk and fell overboard among the crocodiles. The captain, they called him Schenk, was out of his bearings in the job. He was a Frisian, and a first-class deep-water seaman, but, since he knew the Rhine Delta, and because the German mercantile marine was laid on ice till the end of the war, they had turned him on to this show. He was bored by the business, and didn't understand it very well. The river charts puzzled him, and though it was pretty plain going for hundreds of miles, yet he was in a perpetual fidget about the pilotage. You could see that he would have been far more in his element smelling his way through the shoals of the Ems mouth, or beating against a northeaster in a shallow Baltic. He had 6 barges in tow, but the heavy flood of the Danube made it an easy job except when it came to going slow. There were 2 men on each barge, who came aboard every morning to draw rations. That was a funny business, for we never lay to if we could help it. There was a dinghy belonging to each barge, and the men used to row to the next and get a lift on that barge's dinghy, and so forth. 6 men would appear in the dinghy of the barge nearest us and carry off supplies for the rest. The men were mostly Frisians, slow-spoken, sandy-haired lads, very like the breed you strike on the Essex coast. It was the fact that Schenk was really a deep-water sailor, and so a novice at the job, that made me get on with him. He was a good fellow and quite willing to take a hint, so before I had 24 hours on board he was telling me all his difficulties, and I was doing my best to cheer him. And difficulties came thick, because the next night was New Year's Eve. I knew that that night was a season of gaiety in Scotland, but Scotland wasn't in it with the fatherland. Even Schenk, though he was in charge of valuable stores and was voyaging against time, was quite clear that the men must have permission for some kind of beano. Just before darkness we came abreast a fair-sized town, whose name I never discovered, and decided to lie to for the night. The arrangement was that 1 man should be left on guard in each barge, and the other get 4 hours' leave ashore. Then he would return and relieve his friend, who should proceed to do the same thing. I foresaw that there would be some fun when the first batch returned, but I did not dare to protest. I was desperately anxious to get past the Austrian frontier, for I had a half notion we might be searched there. But Schenk took his Silvesteraband business so seriously that I would have risked a row if I had tried to argue. The upshot was what I expected. We got the first batch aboard about midnight, blind to the world, and the others straggled in at all hours next morning. I stuck to the boat for obvious reasons, but next day it became too serious, and I had to go ashore with the captain to try and round up the stragglers. We got them all in but 2, and I am inclined to think these 2 never meant to come back. If I had a soft job, like a river-boat, I shouldn't be inclined to run away in the middle of Germany, with the certainty that my best fate would be to be scooped up for the trenches, but your Frisian has no more imagination than a haddock. The absentees were both watchmen from the barges, and I fancy the monotony of the life had got on their nerves. The captain was in a raging temper, for he was short-handed to begin with. He would have started a press gang, but there was no superfluity of men in that township, nothing but boys and grandfathers. As I was helping to run the trip, I was pretty annoyed also, and I sluiced down the drunkards with icy Danube water, using all the worst language I knew in Dutch and German. It was a raw morning, and as we raged through the riverside streets, I remember I heard the dry crackle of wild geese going overhead, and wished I could get a shot at them. I told one fellow, he was the most troublesome, that he was a disgrace to a great empire, and was only fit to fight with the filthy English. "God in heaven," said the captain, "we can delay no longer. We must make shift the best we can. I can spare one man from the deckhands. You must give up one from the engine-room." That was arranged, and we were tearing back rather short in the wind when I espied a figure sitting on a bench beside the booking office on the pier. It was a slim figure in an old suit of khaki, some cast-off duds which had long lost the semblance of a uniform. It had a gentle face, and was smoking peacefully, looking out upon the river and the boats, and us noisy fellows with meek philosophical eyes. If I had seen General French sitting there and looking like nothing on earth, I couldn't have been more surprised. The man stared at me without recognition. He was waiting for his cue. I spoke rapidly in Sesotho, for I was afraid the captain might know Dutch. "Where have you come from?" I asked. "They shut me up in trunk," said Peter, "and I ran away. I am tired, Cornelius, and I want to continue the journey by boat." "Remember you have worked for me in Africa," I said. "You are just home from Damaraland. You are a German who has lived 30 years away from home. You can tend a furnace and have worked in mines." Then I spoke to the captain. "Here is a fellow who used to be in my employ, Captain Schenk. It's almighty luck we've struck him. He's old, and not very strong in the head, but I'll go bail he's a good worker. He says he'll come with us, and I can use him in the engine-room." "Stand up," said the captain. Peter stood up, light and slim and wiry as a leopard. A sailor does not judge men by girth and weight. "He'll do," said Schenk, and the next minute he was readjusting his crews and giving the strayed revellers the rough side of his tongue. As it chanced, I couldn't keep Peter with me, but had to send him to one of the barges, and I had time for no more than 5 words with him, when I told him to hold his tongue and live up to his reputation as a half-wit. That accursed Silvestara band had played havoc with the whole outfit, and the captain and I were weary men before we got things straight. In one way it turned out well. That afternoon we passed the frontier, and I never knew it till I saw a man in a strange uniform come aboard, who copied some figures on a schedule, and brought us a mail. With my dirty face and general air of absorption in duty, I must have been an unsuspicious figure. He took down the names of the men and the barges, and Peter's name was given as it appeared on the ship's roll. Anton Blum. "You must feel it strange, Herr Brandt," said the captain, "to be scrutinized by a policeman, you who give orders. I do not doubt to many policemen." I shrugged my shoulders. "It is my profession. It is my business to go unrecognized often by my own servants." I could see that I was becoming rather a figure in the captain's eyes. He liked the way I kept the men to their work, for I hadn't been a nigger driver for nothing. Late on that Sunday night we passed through a great city which the captain told me was Vienna. It seemed to last for miles and miles, and to be as brightly lit as a circus. After that we were in big plains, and the air grew perishing cold. Peter came aboard once for his rations, but usually he left it to his partner, for he was lying very low. One morning, I think it was the 5th of January, when we had passed Buda and were moving through great sodden flats just sprinkled with snow, the captain took it into his head to get me to overhaul the barge loads. Armed with a mighty typewritten list, I made a tour of the barges, beginning with the hindmost. There was a fine old stock of deadly weapons, mostly machine guns and some field pieces, and enough shells to blow up the Gallipoli Peninsula. All kinds of shells were there, from the big 14-inch crumps to rifle grenades and trench mortars. It made me fairly sick to see all those good things preparing for our own fellows, and I wondered whether I could not be doing my best service if I engineered a big explosion. Happily, I had the common sense to remember my job and my duty, and to stick to it. Peter was in the middle of the convoy, and I found him pretty unhappy, principally through not being allowed to smoke. His companion was an ox-eyed lad, whom I ordered to the lookout while Peter and I went over the lists.
"Cornelius, my old friend," he said, "there are some pretty toys here. With a spanner and a couple of clear hours I could make these Maxims about as deadly as bicycles. What do you say to a try?" "I've considered that," I said, "but it won't do. We're on a bigger business than wrecking munition convoys. I want to know how you got here." He smiled with that extraordinary Sunday school docility of his. "It was very simple, Cornelius. I was foolish in the cafe, but they have told you of that. You see, I was angry, and I did not reflect. They had separated us, and I could see would treat me as dirt. Therefore my bad temper came out, for, as I have told you, I do not like Germans." Peter gazed lovingly at the little bleak farms which dotted the Hungarian plain. "All night I lay in trunk with no food. In the morning they fed me, and took me hundreds of miles in the train to a place I think is called Newburg. It was a great prison, full of English officers. I asked myself many times on the journey what was the reason of this treatment, for I could see no sense in it. If they wanted to punish me for insulting them, they had the chance to send me off to the trenches. No one could have objected. If they thought me useless, they could have turned me back to Holland. I could not have stopped them. But they treated me as if I were a dangerous man, whereas all their contact hitherto had shown that they thought me a fool. I could not understand it. But I had not been one night in that Newburg place before I thought of the reason. They wanted to keep me under observation as a check upon you, Cornelius. I figured it out this way. They had given you some very important work which required them to let you into some big secret. So far, good. They evidently thought much of you, even Jan Stoneman, though he was as rude as a buffalo. But they did not know you fully, and they wanted to check on you. That check they found in Peter Pienaar. Peter was a fool, and if there was anything to blab, sooner or later Peter would blab it, and they would stretch out a long arm and nip you short, wherever you were. Therefore they must keep old Peter under their eye." "That sounds likely enough," I said. "It was God's truth," said Peter, "and when it was all clear to me, I settled that I must escape. Partly because I am a free man and do not like to be in prison, but mostly because I was not sure of myself. Some day my temper would go again, and I might say foolish things for which Cornelius would suffer. So it was very certain that I must escape. Now, Cornelius, I noticed pretty soon that there were two kinds among the prisoners. There were the real prisoners, mostly English and French, and there were the humbugs. The humbugs were treated apparently like the others, but not really, as I soon perceived. There was one man who passed as an English officer, another as a French Canadian, and the others called themselves Russians. None of the honest men suspected them, but they were there as spies to hatch plots for escape, and get the poor devils caught in the act, and to worm out confidences which might be of value. That is the German notion of good business. I am not a British soldier to think all men are gentlemen. I know that amongst men there are desperate skillums, so I soon picked up this game. It made me very angry, but it was a good thing for my plan. I made my resolution to escape the day I arrived at Newburg, and on Christmas Day I had a plan made." "Peter, you're an old marvel. Do you mean to say you were quite certain of getting away whenever you wanted?" "Quite certain, Cornelius. You see, I have been wicked in my time, and know something about the inside of prisons. You may build them like great castles, or they may be like a big Waldtrunk, only mud and corrugated iron, but there is always a key and a man who keeps it, and that man can be bested. I knew I could get away, but I did not think it would be so easy. That was due to the bogus prisoners, my friends, the spies. I made great pals with them. On Christmas night we were very jolly together. I think I spotted every one of them the first day. I bragged about my past and all I had done, and I told them I was going to escape. They backed me up and promised to help. Next morning I had a plan. In the afternoon, just after dinner, I had to go to the commandant's room. They treated me a little differently from the others, for I was not a prisoner of war, and I went there to be asked questions and to be cursed as stupid Dutchmen. There was no strict guard kept there, for the place was on the second floor, and distant by many yards from any staircase. In the corridor outside the commandant's room there was a window which had no bars, and 4 feet from the window the limb of a great tree. A man might reach that limb, and if he were active as a monkey, might descend to the ground. Beyond that I knew nothing, but I am a good climber, Cornelius. I told the others of my plan. They said it was good, but no one offered to come with me. They were very noble. They declared that the scheme was mine, and I should have the fruit of it, for if more than one tried, detection was certain. I agreed, and thanked them with tears in my eyes. Then one of them very secretly produced a map. We planned out my road, for I was going straight to Holland. It was a long road, and I had no money, for they had taken all my sovereigns when I was arrested. But they promised to get a subscription up among themselves to start me. Again I wept tears of gratitude. This was on Sunday, the day after Christmas, and I settled to make the attempt on the Wednesday afternoon. Now, Cornelius, when the lieutenant took us to see the British prisoners, you remember, he told us many things about the ways of prisons. He told us how they loved to catch a man in the act of escape, so that they could use him harshly with a clear conscience. I thought of that, and calculated that now my friends would have told everything to the commandant, and that they would be waiting to bottle me on the Wednesday. Till then I reckoned I would be slackly guarded, for they would look on me as safe in the net. So I went out of the window next day. It was the Monday afternoon. "That was a bold stroke," I said admiringly. "The plan was bold, but it was not skilful," said Peter modestly. "I had no money beyond 7 marks, and I had but 1 stick of chocolate. I had no overcoat, and it was snowing hard. Further, I could not get down the tree, which had a trunk as smooth and branchless as a blue gum. For a little I thought I would be compelled to give in, and I was not happy. But I had leisure, for I did not think I would be missed before nightfall, and given time a man can do most things. By and by I found a branch which led beyond the outer wall of the yard and hung above the river. This I followed, and then dropped from it into the stream. It was a drop of some yards, and the water was very swift, so that I nearly drowned. I would rather swim the Limpopo, Cornelius, among all the crocodiles, than that icy river. Yet I managed to reach the shore and get my breath lying in the bushes. After that it was plain going, though I was very cold. I knew that I would be sought on the northern roads, as I had told my friends, for no one could dream of an ignorant Dutchman going south away from his kinsfolk. But I had learned enough from the map to know that our road lay southeast, and I had marked this big river. "Did you hope to pick me up?" I asked. "No, Cornelius. I thought you would be traveling in first-class carriages while I be plodding on foot. But I was set on getting to the place you spoke of. How do you call it? Constantinople, where our big business lay. I thought I might be in time for that." "You are an old Trojan, Peter," I said. "But go on. How did you get to that landing stage where I found you?" "It was a hard journey," he said meditatively. "It was not easy to get beyond the barbed wire entanglements which surrounded Newburgh, yes, even across the river. But in time I reached the woods and was safe, for I did not think any German could equal me in wild country. The best of them, even their foresters, are but babes in wildcraft compared to such as me. My troubles came only from hunger and cold. Then I met a Peruvian smous, and sold him my clothes and bought from him these." Peter meant a Polish Jew peddler. I did not want to part with my own, which were better, but he gave me 10 marks on the deal. After that I went into a village and ate heavily. "Were you pursued?" I asked. "I do not think so. They had gone north as I expected, and were looking for me at the railway stations which my friends had marked for me. I walked happily and put a bold face on it,
If I saw a man or woman look at me suspiciously, I went up to them at once and talked. I told a sad tale, and all believed it. I was a poor Dutchman travelling home on foot to see a dying mother, and I had been told that by the Danube I should find the main railway to take me to Holland. There were kind people who gave me food, and one woman gave me half a mark and wished me Godspeed. Then, on the last day of the year, I came to the river and found many drunkards." "Was that when you resolved to get on one of the river boats?" "Ja, Cornelius. As soon as I heard of the boats I saw where my chance lay. But you might have knocked me over with a straw when I saw you come on shore. That was good fortune, my friend. I have been thinking much about the Germans, and I will tell you the truth. It is only boldness that can baffle them. They are a most diligent people. They will think of all likely difficulties, but not of all possible ones. They have not much imagination. They are like steam engines which must keep to prepared tracks. There they will hunt any man down, but let him trek for open country, and they will be at a loss. Therefore boldness, my friend, for ever boldness. Remember, as a nation they wear spectacles, which means that they are always peering." Peter broke off to gloat over the wedges of geese and the strings of wild swans that were always winging across the plains. His tale had bucked me up wonderfully. Our luck had held beyond all belief, and I had a kind of hope in the business now which had been wanting before. That afternoon, too, I got another fillip. I came on deck for a breath of air, and found it pretty cold after the heat of the engine room. So I called to one of the deckhands to fetch me up my cloak from the cabin, the same I had bought that first morning in the Griff village. "Der Greenmantle," the man shouted up, and I cried, "Yes," but the words seemed to echo my ears, and long after he had given me the garment I stood staring abstractedly over the bulwarks. His tone had awakened a chord of memory, or, to be accurate, they had given emphasis to what before had been only blurred and vague, for he had spoken the words which Sturm had uttered behind his hand to Gaudian. I had heard something like "Unmantel," and could make nothing of it. Now I was as certain of those words as of my own existence. They had been Greenmantle. Greenmantle, whatever it might be, was the name which Sturm had not meant me to hear, which was some talisman for the task I had proposed, and which was connected in some way with the mysterious Von Einem. This discovery put me in a high fettle. I told myself that, considering the difficulties, I had managed to find out a wonderful amount in a few days. It only shows what a man can do with the slenderest evidence if he keeps chewing and chewing on it. 2 mornings later we lay alongside the quays at Belgrade, and I took the opportunity of stretching my legs. Peter had come ashore for a smoke, and we wandered among the battered riverside streets and looked at the broken arches of the great railway bridge which the Germans were working at like beavers. There was a big temporary pontoon affair to take the railway across, but I calculated that the main bridge would be ready inside a month. It was a clear, cold, blue day, and as one looked south one saw ridge after ridge of snowy hills. The upper streets of the city were still fairly whole, and there were shops open where food could be got. I remember hearing English spoken, and seeing some Red Cross nurses in the custody of Austrian soldiers coming from the railway station. It would have done me a lot of good to have had a word with them. I thought of the gallant people whose capital this had been. Now 3 times they had flung the Austrians back over the Danube, and then had only been beaten by the black treachery of their so-called allies. Somehow that morning in Belgrade gave both Peter and me a new purpose in our task. It was our business to put a spoke in the wheel of this monstrous, bloody juggernaut that was crushing the life out of the little heroic nations. We were just getting ready to cast off when a distinguished party arrived at the quay. There were all kinds of uniforms, German, Austrian, and Bulgarian, and amid them was one stout gentleman in a fur coat and a black felt hat. They watched the barges up anchor, and before we began to jerk into line I could hear their conversation. The fur coat was talking in English. "I reckon that's pretty good news, General," it said. "If the English have run away from Gallipoli we can use these new consignments for the bigger game. I guess it won't be long before we see the British Lion moving out of Egypt with sore paws." They all laughed. "The privilege of that spectacle may soon be ours," was the reply. I did not pay much attention to the talk. Indeed, I did not realize till weeks later that that was the first tidings of the great evacuation of Cape Helles. What rejoiced me was the sight of Blenkiron, as bland as a barber among those swells. Here were two of the missionaries within reasonable distance of their goal. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Greenmantle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vivian Bush, Houston, Texas, on June 6, 2007. Greenmantle by John Buchan. Chapter 10. The Garden House of Suleiman the Red. We reached Rustchuk on January 10th, but by no means landed on that day. Something had gone wrong with the unloading arrangements, or more likely with the railway behind them, and we were kept swinging all day well out in the turbid river. On top of this, Captain Schenck got an ague, and by that evening was a blue and shivering wreck. He had done me well, and I reckoned I would stand by him. So I got his ship's papers and the manifest of cargo, and undertook to see to the transhipment. It wasn't the first time I had tackled that kind of business, and I hadn't much to learn about steam cranes. I told him I was going on to Constantinople, and would take Peter with me, and he was agreeable. He would have to wait at Rustchuk to get his return cargo, and could easily inspan a fresh engineer. I worked about the hardest 24 hours of my life getting the stuff ashore. The landing officer was a Bulgarian, quite a competent man if he could have made the railways give him the trucks he needed. There was a collection of hungry German transport officers always putting in their oars, and being infernally insolent to everybody. I took the high and mighty line with them, and as I had the Bulgarian commandant on my side, after about 2 hours' blasphemy got them quieted. But the big trouble came the next morning when I had got nearly all the stuff aboard the trucks. A young officer in what I took to be a Turkish uniform rode up with an aide-de-camp. I noticed the German guard saluting him, so I judged he was rather a swell. He came up to me and asked me very civilly in German for the waybills. I gave him them, and he looked carefully through them, marking certain items with a blue pencil. Then he coolly handed them to his aide-de-camp, and spoke to him in Turkish. "Look here, I want these back," I said. "I can't do without them, and we've got no time to waste." "Presently," he said, smiling, and went off. I said nothing, reflecting that the stuff was for the Turks, and they naturally had to have some say in its handling. The loading was practically finished when my gentleman returned. He handed me a neatly typed new set of waybills. One glance at them showed that some of the big items had been left off. "Here, this won't do," I cried. "Give me back the right set. This thing's no good to me." For answer he winked gently, smiled like a dusky seraph, and held out his hand. In it I saw a roll of money. "For yourself," he said. "It is the usual custom." It was the first time anyone had ever tried to bribe me, and it made me boil up like a geyser. I saw his game clearly enough. Turkey would pay for the lot to Germany, probably had already paid the bill, but she would pay double for the things not on the waybills, and pay to this fellow and his friends. This struck me as rather steep even for Oriental methods of doing business. "Now look here, sir," I said. "I don't stir from this place till I get the correct waybills. If you won't give me them, I will have every item out of the trucks and make a new list. But a correct list I have, or the stuff stays here till doomsday." He was a slim, foppish fellow, and he looked more puzzled than angry. "I offered you enough," he said, again stretching out his hand. At that I fairly roared. "If you try to bribe me, you infernal little haberdasher, I'll have you off that horse and chuck you in the river." He no longer misunderstood me. He began to curse and threaten, but I cut him short. "Come along to the commandant, my boy," I said, and I marched away, tearing up his typewritten sheets as I went, and strewing them behind me like a paper chase. We had a fine old racket in the commandant's office. I said it was my business, as representing the German government, to see the stuff delivered to the consignee at Constantinople ship-shape and Bristol fashion. I told him it wasn't my habit to proceed with cooked documents. He couldn't but agree with me, but there was that wrathful Oriental with his face as fixed as a Buddha. "I am sorry, Rasta Bey," he said, "but this man is in the right. I have authority from the committee to receive the stores," he said sullenly. "Those are not my instructions," was the answer. "They are consigned to the artillery commandant at Chatalaja, General von Osterwies." The man shrugged his shoulders. "Very well. I will have a word to say to General von Osterwies, and many to this fellow who flouts the committee." And he strode away like an impudent boy. The harassed commandant grinned. "You have offended his lordship, and he is a bad enemy. All those damned Kamatadjis are. You would be well advised not to go on to Constantinople. And have that blighter in the red hat loot the trucks on the road? No, thank you. I am going to see them safe at Chatalji, or whatever they call the artillery depot." I said a good deal more, but that is an abbreviated translation of my remarks. My word for blighter was trottle, but I used some other expressions which would have ravished my young Turk friend to hear. Looking back, it seems pretty ridiculous to have made all this fuss about guns which were going to be used against my own people. But I didn't see that at the time. My professional pride was up in arms, and I couldn't bear to have a hand in a crooked deal. "Well, I advise you to go armed," said the commandant. "You will have a guard for the trucks, of course, and I will pick you good men. They may hold you up all the same. I can't help you once you are past the frontier, but I'll send a wire to Osterwies, and he'll make trouble if anything goes wrong." I still think he would have been wiser to humour Rasta Bey. As I was leaving, he gave me a telegram. "Here's a wire for your Captain Schenk." I slipped the envelope into my pocket and went out. Schenk was pretty sick, so I left a note for him. At 1 o'clock I got the train started, with a couple of German landwehr in each truck, and Peter and I in a horse box. Presently I remembered Schenk's telegram, which still reposed in my pocket. I took it out and opened it, meaning to wire it from the first station we stopped at. But I changed my mind when I read it. It was from some official at Regensburg, asking him to put under arrest and send back by the first boat a man called Brandt, who was believed to have come aboard at Absfothen on the 30th of December. I whistled and showed it to Peter. The sooner we were at Constantinople the better, and I prayed we would get there before the fellow who sent this wire repeated it and got the commandant to send on the message and have us held up at Chatalja. For my back had fairly got stiffened about these munitions, and I was going to take any risk to see them safely delivered to their proper owner. Peter couldn't understand me at all. He still hankered after a grand destruction of the lot somewhere down the railway. But then this wasn't the line of Peter's profession, and his pride was not at stake. We had a mortally slow journey. It was bad enough in Bulgaria, but when we crossed the frontier at a place called Mustafa Pasha, we stuck the real supineness of the East. Happily I found a German officer there who had some notion of hustling, and after all, it was in his interest to get the stuff moved. It was the morning of the 16th, after Peter and I had been living like pigs on black bread and condemned tin stuff, that we came in sight of a blue sea on our right hand, and knew we couldn't be very far from the end. It was jolly near the end in another sense. We stopped at a station and were stretching our legs on the platform when I saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Rasta with half a dozen Turkish gendarmes. I called Peter and we clambered into the truck next our horse box. I had been half expecting some move like this, and had made a plan. The Turk swaggered up and addressed us. "You can get back to Rustchuk," he said. "I take over from you here. Hand me the papers." "Is this Chatalja?" I asked innocently. "It is the end of your affair," he said haughtily. "Quick, or it will be the worse for you." "Now look here, my son," I said. "You're a kid, and know nothing. I hand over to General von Osterwies and to no one else." "You are in Turkey," he cried, "and will obey the Turkish government." "I'll obey the government right enough," I said, "but if you're the government I could make a better one with a bib and a rattle." He said something to his men, who unslung their rifles. "Please don't begin shooting," I said. "There are 12 armed guards in this train, who will take their orders from me. Besides, I and my friend can shoot a bit." "Fool!" he cried, getting very angry. "I can order up a regiment in 5 minutes." "Maybe you can," I said. "But observe the situation. I am sitting on enough tllooll to blow up this countryside. If you dare to come aboard I will shoot you. If you call in your regiment, I will tell you what I'll do. I'll fire this stuff, and I reckon they'll be picking up the bits of you and your regiment off the Gallipoli Peninsula." He had put up a bluff, a poor one, and I had called it. He saw I meant what I said, and became silken. "Good-bye, sir," he said. "You have had a fair chance, and rejected it. We shall meet again soon, and you will be sorry for your insolence." He strutted away, and it was all I could do to keep from running after him. I wanted to lay him over my knee and spank him. We got safely to Chatalja, and were received by Von Osteries like long-lost brothers. He was the regular gunner officer, not thinking about anything except his guns and shells. I had to wait about 3 hours while he was checking the stuff with the invoices, and then he gave me a receipt, which I still possess. I told him about Rasta, and he agreed that I had done right. It didn't make him as mad as I expected, because, you see, he got his stuff safe in any case. It was only that the wretched Turks had to pay twice for the lot of it. He gave Peter and me luncheon, and was altogether very civil and inclined to talk about the war. I would have liked to hear what he had to say, for it would have been something to get the inside view of Germany's eastern campaign, but I did not dare to wait. At any moment there might arrive an incriminating wire from Rustchuk. Finally he lent us a car to take us the few miles to the city. So it came about that at 3:05 on the 16th day of January, with only the clothes we stood up in, Peter and I entered Constantinople. I was in considerable spirits, for I had got the final lap successfully over, and I was looking forward madly to meeting my friends. But all the same, the first sight was a mighty disappointment. I don't quite know what I had expected. A sort of fairyland eastern city, all white marble and blue water, and stately Turks in surplices, and veiled houris, and roses and nightingales, and some sort of string band discoursing sweet music. I had forgotten that winter is pretty much the same everywhere. It was a drizzling day, with a southeast wind blowing, and the streets were long troughs of mud. The first part I struck looked like a dingy colonial suburb, wooden houses and corrugated iron roofs, and endless dirty, sallow children. There was a cemetery, I remember, with Turks' caps stuck at the head of each grave. Then we got into narrow, steep streets, which descended into a kind of big canal. I saw what I took to be mosques and minarets, and they were about as impressive as factory chimneys. By and by we crossed a bridge, and paid a penny for the privilege. If I had known it was the famous Golden Horn, I would have looked at it with more interest, but I saw nothing save a lot of moth-eaten barges and some queer little boats like gondolas. Then we came into busier streets, where ramshackle cabs drawn by lean horses spluttered through the mud. I saw one old fellow who looked like my notion of a Turk, but most of the population had the appearance of London old-clothes men. All but the soldiers, Turk and German, who seemed well-set-up fellows. Peter had paddled along at my side like a faithful dog, not saying a word, but clearly not approving of this wet and dirty metropolis. "Do you know that we are being followed, Cornelius?" he said suddenly, "ever since we came into this evil-smelling dorp." Peter was infallible in a thing like that. The news scared me badly, for I feared the telegram had come to Chatalja. Then I thought it couldn't be that, for if Von Osteries had wanted me, he wouldn't have taken the trouble to stalk me. It was more likely my friend Rasta. I found the ferry of Ratchik by asking a soldier, and a German sailor there told me where the Kurdish bazaar was. He pointed up a steep street which ran past a high block of warehouses, with every window broken. Sandy had said the left-hand side coming down, so it must be the right-hand side going up. We plunged into it, and it was the filthiest place of all. The wind whistled up it and stirred the garbage. It seemed densely inhabited, for at all the doors there were groups of people squatting, with their heads covered, though scarcely a window showed in the blank walls. The street corkscrewed endlessly. Sometimes it seemed to stop. Then it found a hole in the opposing masonry, and edged its way in. Often it was almost pitch dark. Then would come a greyish twilight where it opened out to the width of a decent lane. To find a house in that murk was no easy job, and by the time we had gone a quarter of a mile I began to fear we had missed it. It was no good asking any of the crowd we met. They didn't look as if they understood any civilized tongue. At last we stumbled on it, a tumble-down coffee-house with A. Caprasso above the door in queer amateur lettering. There was a lamp burning inside, and 2 or 3 men smoking at small wooden tables. We ordered coffee, thick black stuff like treacle, which Peter anathematized. A negro brought it, and I told him in German that I wanted to speak to Mr. Caprasso. He paid no attention, so I shouted louder at him, and the noise brought a man out of the back parts. He was a fat, oldish fellow with a long nose, very like the Greek traders you see on the Zanzibar coast. I beckoned to him, and he waddled forward, smiling oilily. Then I asked him what he would take, and he replied, in very halting German, that he would have a syrup. "You are Mr. Caprasso," I said. "I wanted to show this place to my friend. He has heard of your garden house, and the fun there." "The Senor is mistaken. I have no garden house." "Rot," I said. "I've been here before, my boy. I recall your shanty at the back, and many merry nights there. What was it you called it? Oh, I remember. The garden house of Suleiman the Red." He put his finger to his lip, and looked incredibly sly. "The Signor remembers that. But that was in the old happy days, before the war came. The place is long since shut. The people here are too poor to dance and sing." "All the same, I would like to have another look at it," I said, and I slipped an English sovereign into his hand. He glanced at it in surprise, and his manner changed. "The Signor is a prince, and I will do his will." He clapped his hands, and the negro appeared, and at his nod took his place behind a little side counter. "Follow me," he said, and led us through a long, noisome passage, which was pitch dark and very unevenly paved. Then he unlocked a door, and with a swirl the wind caught it, and blew it back on us. We were looking into a mean little yard, with on one side a high curving wall, evidently of great age, with bushes growing in the cracks of it. Some scraggy myrtles stood in broken pots, and nettles flourished in a corner. At one end was a wooden building like a dissenting chapel, but painted a dingy scarlet. Its windows and skylights were black with dirt, and its door, tied up with rope, flapped in the wind. "Behold the pavilion," Caprasso said proudly. "That is the old place," I observed with feeling. "What times I've seen there! Tell me, Mr. Caprasso, do you ever open it now?" He put his thick lips to my ear. "If the Signor will be silent, I will tell him. It is sometimes open, not often. Men must amuse themselves even in war. Some of the German officers come here for their pleasure, but last week we had the ballet of Mademoiselle Cici. The police approve, but not often, for this is no time for too much gaiety. I will tell you a secret. Tomorrow afternoon there will be dancing, wonderful dancing. Only a few of my patrons know. Who, think you, will be here?" He bent his head closer and said in a whisper, "The Compagnie des Jours Roses." "Oh, indeed," I said with a proper tone of respect, though I hadn't a notion what he meant. "Will the Signor wish to come?" "Sure," I said, "both of us. We're all for the rosy hours." "Then the 4th hour after midday. Walk straight through the cafe, and one will be there to unlock the door. You are newcomers here? Take the advice of Angelo Caprasso, and avoid the streets after nightfall. Stamboul is no safe place nowadays for quiet men." I asked him to name a hotel, and he rattled off a list from which I chose one that sounded modest and in keeping with our get-up. It was not far off, only 100 yards to the right at the top of the hill. When we left his door the night had begun to drop. We hadn't gone 20 yards before Peter drew very near to me and kept turning his head like a hunted stag. "We are being followed close, Cornelius," he said calmly. Another 10 yards and we were at a crossroads where Little Place faced a biggish mosque. I could see in the waning light a crowd of people who seemed to be moving towards us. I heard a high-pitched voice cry out a jabber of excited words, and it seemed to me that I had heard the voice before. End of chapter 10.
Of Greenmantle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greenmantle by John Buchan. Chapter 11. The Companions of the Rosy Hours. We battled to a corner where a jut of buildings stood out into the street. It was our only chance to protect our backs, to stand up with the rib of stone between us. It was only the work of seconds. One instant we were groping our solitary way in the darkness, the next we were pinned against the wall with a throaty mob surging round us. It took me a moment or two to realize that we were attacked. Every man has one special funk in the back of his head, and mine was to be the quarry of an angry crowd. I hated the thought of it, the mess, the blind struggle, the sense of unleashed passions different from those of any single blackguard. It was a dark world to me, and I don't like darkness. But in my nightmares I had never imagined anything just like this. The narrow, fetid street, with the icy winds fanning the filth, the unknown tongue, the hoarse, savage murmur, and my utter ignorance as to what it might be all about, made me cold in the pit of my stomach. "We've got it in the neck this time, old man," I said to Peter, who had out the pistol the commandant at Rustchuk had given him. These pistols were our only weapons. The crowd saw them and hung back, but if they chose to rush us, it wasn't much of a barrier 2 pistols would make. Rasta's voice had stopped. He had done his work, and had retired to the background. There were shouts from the crowd, "Alaman!" and a word, "Kafia!" constantly repeated. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but now I know that they were after us because we were Boches and spies. There was no love lost between the Constantinople scum and their new masters. It seemed an ironical end for Peter and me to be done in because we were Boches. And done in we should be. I had heard of the East as a good place for people to disappear in. There were no inquisitive newspapers or incorruptible police. I wish to heaven I had a word of Turkish, but I made my voice heard for a second in a pause in the din, and shouted that we were German sailors who had brought down big guns for Turkey and were going home next day. I asked them what the devil they thought we had done. I don't know if any fellow there understood German. Anyhow, it only brought a pandemonium of cries in which that ominous word, "Kafia!" was predominant. Then Peter fired over their heads. He had to, for a chap was pawing at his throat. The answer was a clatter of bullets on the wall above us. It looked as if they meant to take us alive, and that, I was very clear, should not happen. Better a bloody end in a street scrap than the tender mercies of that bandbox bravo. I don't know quite what happened next. A press drove down at me, and I fired. Someone squealed, and I looked the next moment to be strangled, and then, suddenly, the scrimmage ceased, and there was a wavering splash of light in that pit of darkness. I never went through many worse minutes than these. When I had been hunted in the past weeks, there had been mystery enough, but no immediate peril to face. When I had been up against a real, urgent, physical risk like Lewes, the danger, at any rate, had been clear. One knew what one was in for. But here was a threat I couldn't put a name to, and it wasn't in the future, but pressing hard at our throats. And yet I couldn't feel it was quite real. The patter of the pistol bullets against the wall, like so many crackers, the faces felt rather than seen in the dark, the clamour, which to me was pure gibberish, had all the madness of a nightmare. Only Peter, cursing steadily in Dutch by my side, was real. And then the light came, and made the scene more eerie. It came from 1 or 2 torches carried by wild fellows with long staves who drove their way into the heart of the mob. The flickering glare ran up the steep walls and made monstrous shadows. The wind swung the flame into long streamers, dying away in a fan of sparks. And now a new word was heard in the crowd. It was "Chingana!" shouted not in anger, but in fear. At first I could not see the newcomers. They were hidden in the deep darkness under their canopy of light, for they were holding their torches high at the full stretch of their arms. They were shouting too, wild shrill cries ending sometimes in a gush of rapid speech. Their words did not seem to be directed against us, but against the crowd. A sudden hope came to me that for some unknown reason they were on our side. The press was no longer heavy against us. It was thinning rapidly, and I could hear the scuffle as men made off down the side streets. My first notion was that these were the Turkish police, but I changed my mind when the leader came out into a patch of light. He carried no torch, but a long stave with which he belaboured the heads of those who were too tightly packed to flee. It was the most eldritch apparition you can conceive. a tall man dressed in skins, with bare legs and sandal-shod feet. A wisp of scarlet cloth clung to his shoulders, and drawn over his head down close to his eyes was a skull-cap of some kind of pelt with the tail waving behind it. He capered like a wild animal, keeping up a strange high monotone that fairly gave me the creeps. I was suddenly aware that the crowd had gone. Before us was only this figure and his half-dozen companions, some carrying torches and all wearing clothes of skin. But only the one who seemed to be their leader wore the skull-cap, the rest had bare heads and long tangled hair. The fellow was shouting gibberish at me. His eyes were glassy, like a man who smokes hemp, and his legs were never still for a second. You would think such a figure no better than a mountebank, and yet there was nothing comic in it. Fearful and sinister and uncanny it was, and I wanted to do anything but laugh. As he shouted, he kept pointing with his stave up the street, which climbed the hillside. "He means us to move," said Peter. "For God's sake, let's get away from this witch-doctor." I couldn't make sense of it, but one thing was clear. These maniacs had delivered us, for the moment, from Rasta and his friends. Then I did a dashed silly thing. I pulled out a sovereign and offered it to the leader. I had some kind of notion of showing gratitude, and as I had no words, I had to show it by deed. He brought his stick down on my wrist and sent the coin spinning in the gutter. His eyes blazed, and he made his weapon swing round my head. He cursed me. Oh, I could tell cursing well enough, though I didn't follow a word. And he cried to his followers, and they cursed me too. I had offered him a mortal insult, and stirred up a worse hornet's nest than Rasta's push. Peter and I, with a common impulse, took to our heels. We were not looking for any trouble with demoniacs. Up the steep, narrow lane we ran, with that bedlamite crowd at our heels. The torches seemed to have gone out, for the place was black as pitch, and we tumbled over heaps of offal and splashed through running drains. The men were close behind us, and more than once I felt a stick on my shoulder. But fear lent us wings, and suddenly before us was a blaze of light, and we saw the debouchement of our street in a main thoroughfare. The others saw it too, for they slackened off. Just before we reached the light, we stopped and looked round. There was no sound or sight behind us in the dark lane which dipped to the harbour. "This is a queer country, Cornelius," said Peter, feeling his limbs for bruises. "Too many things happen in too short a time. I am breathless." The big street we had struck seemed to run along the crest of the hill. There were lamps in it, and crawling cabs, and quite civilized-looking shops. We soon found the hotel to which Caprasso had directed us, a big place in a courtyard with a very tumble-down-looking portico, and green sun-shutters which rattled drearily in the winter's wind. It proved, as I had feared, to be packed to the door, mostly with German officers. With some trouble I got an interview with the proprietor, the usual Greek, and told him that we had been sent there by Mr. Caprasso. That didn't affect him in the least, and we would have been shot into the street if I hadn't remembered about Stumm's pass. So I explained that we had come from Germany with munitions, and only wanted rooms for one night. I showed him the pass and blustered a good deal, till he became civil and said he would do the best he could for us. The best was pretty poor. Peter and I were doubled up in a small room which contained 2 camp beds and little else, and had broken windows through which the wind whistled. We had a wretched dinner of stringy mutton boiled with vegetables, and a white cheese strong enough to raise the dead. But I got a bottle of whisky, for which I paid a sovereign, and we managed to light the stove in our room, fasten the shutters, and warm our hearts with a brew of toddy. After that we went to bed and slept like logs for 12 hours. On the road from Rustchuk we had had uneasy slumbers. I woke the next morning, and looking from the broken window saw that it was snowing. With a lot of trouble I got hold of a servant and made him bring us some of the treacly Turkish coffee. We were both in pretty low spirits. "Europe is a poor cold place," said Peter, "not worth fighting for. There is only one white man's land, and that is South Africa." At the time I heartily agreed with him. I remember that sitting on the edge of my bed I took stock of our position. It was not very cheering. We seemed to have been amassing enemies at a furious pace. First of all there was Rasta, whom I had insulted, and who wouldn't forget it in a hurry. He had his crowd of Turkish riffraff, and was bound to get us sooner or later. Then there was the maniac in the skin hat. He didn't like Rasta, and I made a guess that he and his weird friends were of some party hostile to the Young Turks. But on the other hand, he didn't like us, and there would be bad trouble the next time we met him. Finally there was Stumm and the German government. It could only be a matter of hours at the best before he got the Rustchuk authorities on our trail. It would be easy to trace us from Chataldja, and once they had us we were absolutely done. There was a big black dossier against us, which by no conceivable piece of luck could be upset. It was very clear to me that, unless we could find sanctuary and shed all our various pursuers during this day, we should be done in for good and all. But where on earth were we to find sanctuary? We had neither of us a word of the language, and there was no way I could see of taking on new characters. For that we wanted friends and help, and I could think of none anywhere. Somewhere, to be sure, there was Blenkiron, but how could we get in touch with him? As for Sandy, I had pretty well given him up. I always thought his enterprise the craziest of the lot and bound to fail. He was probably somewhere in Asia Minor, and a month or two later would get to Constantinople and hear in some pothouse the yarn of the two wretched Dutchmen who had disappeared so soon from men's sight. That rendezvous at Kuprasso's was no good. It would have been all right if we had got here unsuspected, and could have gone on quietly frequenting the place till Blenkiron picked us up. But to do that we wanted leisure and secrecy, and here we were with a pack of hounds at our heels. The place was horribly dangerous already. If we showed ourselves there, we should be gathered in by Rasta, or by the German military police, or by the madman in the skin cap. It was a stark impossibility to hang about on the off chance of meeting Blenkiron. I reflected with some bitterness that this was the 17th day of January, the day of our assignation. I had had high hopes all the way down the Danube of meeting with Blenkiron, for I knew he would be in time, of giving him the information I had had the good fortune to collect, of piecing it together with what he had found out, and of getting the whole story which Sir Walter hungered for. After that, I thought it wouldn't be hard to get away by Roumania and to get home through Russia. I had hoped to be back with my battalion in February, having done as good a bit of work as anybody in the war. As it was, it looked as if my information would die with me, unless I could find Blenkiron before the evening. I talked the thing over with Peter, and he agreed that we were fairly up against it. We decided to go to Kuprasso's that afternoon, and to trust to luck for the rest. It wouldn't do to wander about the streets, so we sat tight in our room all morning, and swapped old hunting yarns to keep our minds from the beastly present. We got some food at midday, cold mutton and the same cheese, and finished our whisky. Then I paid the bill, for I didn't dare to stay there another night. About 3:30 we went into the street, without the foggiest notion where we would find our next quarters. It was snowing heavily, which was a piece of luck for us. Poor old Peter had no greatcoat, so we went into a Jew's shop and bought a ready-made abomination, which looked as if it might have been meant for a dissenting parson. It was no good saving my money when the future was so black. The snow made the streets deserted, and we turned down the long lane which led to Ratchik Ferry, and found it perfectly quiet. I do not think we met a soul till we got to Kuprasso's shop. We walked straight through the café, which was empty, and down the dark passage, till we were stopped by the garden door. I knocked, and it swung open. There was the bleak yard, now puddled with snow, and a blaze of light from the pavilion at the other end. There was a scraping of fiddles, too, and the sound of human talk. We paid the negro at the door, and passed from the bitter afternoon into a garish saloon. There were 40 or 50 people there, drinking coffee and syrups, and filling the air with the fumes of Latakia. Most of them were Turks in European clothes and the fez, but there were some German officers and what looked like German civilians, Army Service Corps clerks probably, and mechanics from the arsenal. A woman in cheap finery was tinkling at the piano, and there were several shrill females with the officers. Peter and I sat down modestly in the nearest corner, where old Kuprasso saw us and sent us coffee. A girl who looked like a Jewess came over to us and talked French, but I shook my head, and she went off again. Presently a girl came on the stage and danced, a silly affair, all a clashing of tambourines and wriggling. I have seen native women do the same thing better in a Mozambique chorale. Another sang a German song, a simple, sentimental thing about golden hair and rainbows, and the Germans present applauded. The place was so tinselly and common that coming to it from weeks of rough travelling it made me impatient. I forgot that, while for the others it might be a vulgar little dancing hall, for us it was as perilous as a brigand's den. Peter did not share my mood. He was quite interested in it, as he was interested in everything new. He had a genius for living in the moment. I remember there was a drop scene on which was daubed a blue lake with very green hills in the distance. As the tobacco smoke grew thicker and the fiddles went on squealing, this tawdry picture began to mesmerize me. I seemed to be looking out of a window at a lovely summer landscape where there were no wars or danger. I seemed to feel the warm sun and to smell the fragrance of blossom from the islands. And then I became aware that a queer scent had stolen into the atmosphere. There were braziers burning at both ends to warm the room, and the thin smoke from these smelt like incense. Somebody had been putting a powder in the flames, for suddenly the place became very quiet. The fiddles still sounded, but far away like an echo. The lights went down, all but a circle on the stage, and into that circle stepped my enemy of the skin cap. He had 3 others with him. I heard a whisper behind me, and the words were those which Caprasso had used the day before. These bedlamites were called the companions of the rosy hours, and Caprasso had promised great dancing. I hoped to goodness they would not see us, for they had fairly given me the horrors. Peter felt the same, and we both made ourselves very small in that dark corner. But the newcomers had no eyes for us. In a twinkling the pavilion changed from a common saloon, which might have been in Chicago or Paris, to a place of mystery, yes, and of beauty. It became the garden house of Suleiman the Red, whoever that sportsman may have been. Sandy had said that the ends of the earth converged there, and he had been right. I lost all consciousness of my neighbours, stout German, frock-coated Turk, frowsy Jewess, and saw only strange figures leaping in a circle of light, figures that came out of the deepest darkness to make a big magic. The leader flung some stuff into the brazier, and a great fan of blue light flared up. He was weaving circles, and he was singing something shrill and high, whilst his companions made a chorus with their deep monotone. I can't tell you what the dance was. I had seen the Russian ballet just before the war, and one of the men in it reminded me of this man, but the dancing was the least part of it. It was neither sound nor movement nor scent that wrought the spell, but something far more potent. In an instant I found myself reft away from the present with its dull dangers, and looking at a world all young and fresh and beautiful. The gaudy drop scene had vanished. It was a window I was looking from, and I was gazing at the finest landscape on earth, lit by the pure clean light of the morning. It seemed to be part of the veld, but like no veld I had ever seen. It was wider and wilder and more gracious. Indeed, I was looking at my first youth. I was feeling the kind of immortal light-heartedness which only a boy knows in the dawning of his days. I had no longer any fear of these magic makers. They were kindly wizards who had brought me into fairyland. Then slowly from the silence there distilled drops of music. They came like water falling a long way into a cup, each the essential quality of pure sound. We, with our elaborate harmonies, have forgotten the charms of single notes. The African natives know it, and I remember a learned man once telling me that the Greeks had the same art. Those silver bells broke out of infinite space, so exquisite and perfect that no mortal words could have been fitted to them. That was the music, I expect, that the morning stars made when they sang together. Slowly, very slowly, it changed. The glow passed from blue to purple, and then to an angry red. Bit by bit the notes spun together till they made a harmony, a fierce, restless harmony, and I was conscious again of the skin-clad dancers beckoning out of their circle. There was no mistake about the meaning now. All the daintiness and youth had fled, and passion was beating the air. Terrible, savage passion, which belonged neither to day nor night, life nor death, but to the half-world between them. I suddenly felt the dancers as monstrous, inhuman, devilish. The thick scents that floated from the brazier seemed to have a tang of new-shed blood. Cries broke from the hearers, cries of anger and lust and terror. I heard a woman sob, and Peter, who is as tough as any mortal, took tight hold of my arm. I now realized that these companions of the rosy hours were the only thing in the world to fear. Rasta and Stum seemed feeble simpletons by contrast. The window I had been looking out of was changed to a prison wall. I could see the mortar between the massive blocks. In a second these devils would be smelling out their enemies like some foul witch-doctors. I felt the burning eyes of their leader looking for me in the gloom. Peter was praying audibly beside me, and I could have choked him. His infernal chatter would reveal us, for it seemed to me that there was no one in the place except us and the magic workers. Then suddenly the spell was broken. The door was flung open, and a great gust of icy wind swirled through the hall, driving clouds of ashes from the braziers. I heard loud voices without, and a hubbub began inside. For a moment it was quite dark, and then someone lit one of the flare lamps by the stage. It revealed nothing but the common squalor of a low saloon: white faces, sleepy eyes, and frowsy heads. The drop-piece was there in all its tawdriness. The companions of the rosy hours had gone, but at the door stood men in uniform. I heard a German a long way off murmur, "Anwärts, bodyguards," and I heard him distinctly, for though I could not see clearly, my hearing was desperately acute. That is often the way when you suddenly come out of a swoon. The place emptied like magic. Turk and German tumbled over each other, while Caprasso wailed and wept. No one seemed to stop them, and then I saw the reason. Those guards had come for us. This must be Stumm at last. The authorities had tracked us down, and it was all up with Peter and me. A sudden revulsion leaves a man with a low vitality. I didn't seem to care greatly. We were done, and there was an end of it. It was Kismet, the act of God, and there was nothing for it but to submit. I hadn't a flicker of a thought of escape or resistance. The game was utterly and absolutely over. A man who seemed to be a sergeant pointed to us and said something to Caprasso, who nodded. We got heavily to our feet and stumbled towards them. With one on each side of us we crossed the yard, walked through the dark passage and the empty shop, and out into the snowy street. There was a closed carriage waiting, which they motioned us to get into. It looked exactly like the Black Maria. Both of us sat still, like truant schoolboys, with our hands on our knees. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. We seemed to be rumbling up the hill, and then I caught the glare of lighted streets. "This is the end of it, Peter," I said. "Ja, Cornelius," he replied, and that was all our talk. By and by, hours later it seemed, we stopped. Someone opened the door, and we got out, to find ourselves in a courtyard with a huge dark building around. The prison, I guessed, and I wondered if they would give us blankets, for it was perishingly cold. We entered a door, and found ourselves in a big stone hall. It was quite warm, which made me more hopeful about our cells. A man in some kind of uniform pointed to the staircase, up which we plodded wearily. My mind was too blank to take clear impressions, or in any way to forecast the future. Another warder met us and took us down a passage till we halted at a door. He stood aside and motioned us to enter. I guessed that this was the governor's room, and we should be put through our first examination. My head was too stupid to think, and I made up my mind to keep perfectly mum. Yes, even if they tried thumbscrews. I had no kind of story, but I resolved not to give anything away. As I turned the handle, I wondered idly what kind of sallow Turk or bulging-necked German we should find inside. It was a pleasant room, with a polished wood floor and a big fire burning on the hearth. Beside the fire a man lay on a couch, with a little table drawn up beside him. On that table was a small glass of milk, and a number of patience cards spread in rows. I stared blankly at the spectacle, till I saw a second figure. It was the man in the skin cap, the leader of the dancing maniacs. Both Peter and I backed sharply at the sight, and then stood stock still. For the dancer crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped both of my hands. "Dick, old man," he cried, "I'm most awfully glad to see you again." End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Greenmantle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded on June 18, 2007 by Vivian Bush in Houston, Texas. Greenmantle by John Buchan. Chapter 12. 4 missionaries see light in their mission. A spasm of incredulity, a vast relief, and that sharp joy which comes of reaction chased each other across my mind. I had come suddenly out of very black waters into an unbelievable calm. I dropped into the nearest chair and tried to grapple with something far beyond words. "Sandy," I said, as soon as I got my breath, "you're an incarnate devil. You've given Peter and me the fright of our lives." "It was the only way, Dick. If I hadn't come mewing like a tomcat at your heels yesterday, Rasta would have had you long before you got to your hotel. You two have given me a pretty anxious time, and it took some doing to get you safe here. However, that is all over now. Make yourselves at home, my children." "Over!" I said incredulously, for my wits were still wool-gathering. What place is this?" "You may call it my humble home." It was Blenkiron's sleek voice that spoke. "We've been preparing for you, Major, but it was only yesterday I heard of your friend." I introduced Peter. "Mr. Pinar," said Blenkiron, "pleased to meet you. Well, as I was observing, you're safe enough here, but you've cut it mighty fine. Officially, a Dutchman called Brant was to be arrested this afternoon and handed over to the German authorities. When Germany begins to trouble about that Dutchman, she will find difficulty in getting the body. But such are the languid ways of an Oriental despotism. Meanwhile the Dutchman will be no more. He will have ceased upon the midnight, without pain, as your poet sings." "But I don't understand," I stammered. "Who arrested us?" "My men," said Sandy. "We have a bit of a graft here, and it wasn't difficult to manage it. Old Mollendorf will be nosing after the business tomorrow, but he will find the mystery too deep for him. That is the advantage of a government run by a pack of adventurers. But by Jove, Dick, we haven't any time to spare. If Rasta had got you, or the Germans had had the job of lifting you, your goose would have been jolly well cooked. I had some unquiet hours this morning." The thing was too deep for me. I looked at Blenkiron, shuffling his patience cards with his old sleepy smile, and Sandy, dressed like some bandit in melodrama, his lean face as brown as a nut, his bare arms all tattooed with crimson rings, and the fox pelt drawn tight over brow and ears. It was still a nightmare world, but the dream was getting pleasanter. Peter said not a word, but I could see his eyes heavy with his own thoughts. Blenkiron hove himself from the sofa and waddled to a cupboard. "You boys must be hungry," he said. "My duodenum has been giving me hell as usual, and I don't eat no more than a squirrel. But I've laid in some stores, for I guessed you would want to stoke up some after your travels." He brought out a couple of Strasburg pies, a cheese, a cold chicken, a loaf, and 3 bottles of champagne. "Fizz," said Sandy rapturously, "and a dry Heideseck too. We're in luck, Dick, old man." I never ate a more welcome meal, for we had starved in that dirty hotel. But I had still the old feeling of the hunted, and before I began I asked about the door. "That's all right," said Sandy. "My fellows are on the stair and at the gate. If the Metreb are in possession, you may bet that other people will keep off. Your past is blotted out, clean vanished away, and you begin tomorrow with a new sheet. Blenkiron's the man you've got to thank for that. He was pretty certain you'd get here, but he was also certain that you'd arrive in a hurry with a good many inquirers behind you, so he arranged that you should leak away and start fresh. Your name is Richard Hannay," Blenkiron said, "born in Cleveland, Ohio, of German parentage on both sides. One of our brightest mining engineers, and the apple of Guggenheim's eye. You arrived this afternoon from Constanza, and I met you at the packet. The clothes for the part are in your bedroom next door. But I guess all that can wait, for I'm anxious to get to business. We're not here on a joy ride, Major, so I reckon we'll leave out the dime novel adventures. I'm just dying to hear them, but they'll keep. I want to know how our mutual inquiries have prospered." He gave Peter and me cigars, and we sat ourselves in armchairs in front of the blaze. Sandy squatted cross-legged on the hearth-rug, and lit a foul old briar pipe, which he extricated from some pouch among his skins. And so began that conversation which had never been out of my thoughts for 4 hectic weeks. "If I presume to begin," said Blenkiron, "it's because I reckon my story is the shortest. I have to confess to you, gentlemen, that I have failed." He drew down the corners of his mouth till he looked like a cross between a music-hall comedian and a sick child. "If you were looking for something in the root of the hedge, you wouldn't want to scour the road in a high-speed automobile, and still less would you want to get a bird's-eye view in an aeroplane. That parable about fits my case. I've been in the clouds, and I've been scorching on the pikes, but what I was wanting was in the ditch all the time, and I naturally missed it. I had the wrong stunt, Major. I was too high up and refined. I've been processing through Europe like Barnum's Circus, and living with generals and transparencies. Not that I haven't picked up a lot of news, and got some very interesting sidelights on high politics, but the thing I was after wasn't to be found on my beat, for those that knew it weren't going to tell. In that kind of society they don't get drunk and blab after their 10th cocktail. So I guess I've no contribution to make to quieting Sir Walter Bullivant's mind, except that he's dead right. Yes, sir, he has hit the spot and rung the bell. There is a mighty miracle-working proposition being floated in these parts, but the promoters are keeping it to themselves. They aren't taking in more than they can help on the ground floor." Blenkiron stopped to light a fresh cigar. He was leaner than when he had left London, and there were pouches below his eyes. I fancy his journey had not been as fur-lined as he made out. I found out one thing, and that is, that the last dream Germany will part with is control of the Near East. That is what your statesmen don't figure enough on. She'll give up Belgium and Alsace-Lorraine and Poland, but by God, she'll never give up the road to Mesopotamia till you have her by the throat and make her drop it. Sir Walter is a pretty bright-eyed citizen, and he sees it right enough. If the worst happens, Kaiser will fling overboard a lot of ballast in Europe, and it will look like a big victory for the Allies. But he won't be beaten if he has the road to the East safe. Germany's like a scorpion. Her sting's in her tail, and that tail stretches away down into Asia. I got that clear, and I also made out that it wasn't going to be dead easy for her to keep that tail healthy. Turkey's a bit of an anxiety, as you'll soon discover. But Germany thinks she can manage it, and I won't say she can't. It depends on the hand she holds, and I reckon it is a good one. I tried to find out, but they gave me nothing but eyewash. I had to pretend to be satisfied, for the position of John S. wasn't so strong as to allow him to take liberties. If I asked one of the highbrows, he looked wise, and spoke of the might of German arms, and German organization, and German staff work. I used to nod my head and get enthusiastic about these stunts, but it was all soft soap. She has a trick in hand, that much I know, but I'm darned if I can put a name to it. I pray to God you boys have been cleverer. His tone was quite melancholy, and I was mean enough to feel rather glad. He had been the professional with the best chance. It would be a good joke if the amateur succeeded where the expert failed. I looked at Sandy. He filled his pipe again, and pushed back his skin cap from his brows. What with his long dishevelled hair, his high-boned face, and stained eyebrows, he had the appearance of some mad mullah. I went straight to Smyrna, he said. It wasn't difficult, for you see I had laid down a good many lines in former travels. I reached the town as a Greek moneylender from the Fayum, but I had friends there I could count on, and the same evening I was a Turkish gypsy, a member of the most famous fraternity in Western Asia. I had long been a member, and I'm blood brother of the chief boss, so I stepped into the part ready-made. But I found out that the company of the Rosy Hours was not what I had known it in 1910. Then it had been all for the Young Turks and reform. Now it hankered after the old regime and was the last hope of the orthodox. It had no use for Enver and his friends, and it did not regard with pleasure the Beaux of the Teuton. It stood for Islam in the old ways, and might be described as a conservative nationalist caucus. But it was uncommon powerful in the provinces, and Enver and Talat daren't meddle with it. The dangerous thing about it was that it said nothing, and apparently did nothing. It just bided its time and took notes. You can imagine that this was the very kind of crowd for my purpose. I knew of old its little ways, for with all its orthodoxy it dabbled a good deal in magic, and owed half its power to its atmosphere of the uncanny. The companions could dance the heart out of the ordinary Turk. You saw a bit of one of our dances this afternoon, Dick. Pretty good, wasn't it? They could go anywhere, and no questions asked. They knew what the ordinary man was thinking, for they were the best intelligence department in the Ottoman Empire, far better than Enver's kafaya. And they were popular, too, for they had never bowed the knee to the Nimsa, the Germans who are squeezing out the lifeblood of the Amanli for their own ends. It would have been as much as the life of the committee or its German masters was worth to lay a hand on us, for we clung together like leeches, and we were not in the habit of sticking at trifles. Well, you can imagine it wasn't difficult for me to move where I wanted. My dress and the password franked me anywhere. I travelled from Smyrna by the new railway to Panderma on the Marmora, and got there just before Christmas. That was after Anzac and Suvla had been evacuated, but I could hear the guns going hard at Cape Helles. From Panderma I started to cross to Thrace in a coasting steamer, and there an uncommon funny thing happened. I got torpedoed. It must have been about the last effort of a British submarine in those waters. But she got us all right. She gave us 10 minutes to take to the boats, and then sent the blighted old packet and a fine cargo of 6-inch shells to the bottom. There weren't many passengers, so it was easy enough to get ashore in the ship's boats. The submarine sat on the surface watching us, and we wailed and howled in the true Oriental way, and I saw the captain quite close in the conning tower. Who do you think it was? Tommy Elliot, who lives on the other side of the hill from me at home. I gave Tommy the surprise of his life. As we bumped past him, I started the Flowers of the Forest, the old version, on the antique stringed instrument I carried, and I sang the words very plain. Tommy's eyes bulged out of his head, and he shouted at me in English to know who the devil I was. I replied it in the broadest Scots, which no man in the submarine or in our boat could have understood a word of. "Maister Tammy," I cried, "what for would ye scale a dacent tinkler lad into a cold say? I'll gie ye your kail through the rake for this ploy the next time I forgather with ye on the top of the Caedron." Tommy spotted me in a second. He laughed till he cried, and as we moved off shouted to me in the same language, "To put a stoot here in ae starry brae." I hope to heaven he had the sense not to tell my father, or the old man will have a fit. He never much approved of my wanderings, and thought I was safely anchored in the battalion. Well, to make a long story short, I got to Constantinople, and pretty soon found touch with Blenkiron. The rest you know. And now for business. I've been fairly lucky, but no more, for I haven't got to the bottom of the thing, nor anything like it. But I've solved the first of Harry Bullivant's riddles. I know the meaning of Khazredin. Sir Walter was right, as Blenkiron has told us. There's a great stirring in Islam, something moving on the face of the waters. They make no secret of it. Those religious revivals come in cycles, and one was due about now. And they are quite clear about the details. A seer has arisen of the blood of the Prophet, who will restore the Caliphate to its old glories and Islam to its old purity. His sayings are everywhere in the Muslim world. All the orthodox believers have them by heart. That is why they are enduring grinding poverty and preposterous taxation, and that is why their young men are rolling up to the armies and dying without complaint in Gallipoli and Transcaucasia. They believe they are on the eve of a great deliverance. Now the first thing I found out was that the Young Turks had nothing to do with this. They are unpopular and unorthodox, and no true Turks. But Germany has. How, I don't know, but I could see quite plainly that in some subtle way Germany was regarded as a collaborator in the movement. It is that belief that is keeping the present regime going. The ordinary Turk loathes the committee, but he has some queer perverted expectation from Germany. It is not a case of Enver and the rest carrying on the shoulders the unpopular Teuton. It is a case of the Teuton carrying the unpopular committee. And Germany's graft is just this and nothing more, that she has some hand in the coming of the new deliverer. They talk about the thing quite openly. It is called the Kaiba-i-Urying, the Palladium of Liberty. The Prophet himself is known as Zimrud, the Emerald, and his 4 ministers are called also after jewels, sapphire, ruby, pearl, and topaz. You will hear their names as often in the talk of the towns and villages as you will hear the names of generals in England. But no one knew where Zimrud was or when he would reveal himself, though every week came his messages to the faithful. All that I could learn was that he and his followers were coming from the west. You will say, what about Khazredin? That puzzled me dreadfully, for no one used the phrase. The home of the spirit. It is an obvious cliché, just as in England some new sect might call itself the Church of Christ. Only no one seemed to use it. But by and by I discovered that there was an inner and an outer circle in this mystery. Every creed has an esoteric side which is kept from the common herd. I struck this side in Constantinople. Now there is a very famous Turkish shaka called Khazredin, one of those old half-comic miracle plays with an allegorical meaning which they call Orta Oyen, which takes a week to read. That tale tells of the coming of a prophet, and I found that the select of the faith spoke of the new revelation in terms of it. The curious thing is that in that tale the prophet is aided by one of the few women who play much part in the hagiology of Islam. That is the point of the tale, and it is partly a jest, but mainly a religious mystery. The prophet, too, is not called Emerald. I know, I said. He is called Greenmantle. Sandy scrambled to his feet, letting his pipe drop in the fireplace. Now how on earth did you find out that? He cried. Then I told them of Stoom and Gaudian and the whispered words I had not been meant to hear. Blenkiron was giving me the benefit of a steady stare, unusual from one who seemed always to have his eyes abstracted, and Sandy had taken to ranging up and down the room. Germany's in the heart of the plan. That is what I always thought. If we are to find the Kaba-i-Euryi, it is no good fossicking among the committee or in the Turkish provinces. The secret's in Germany. Dick, you should not have crossed the Danube. That's what I half feared, I said. But on the other hand, it is obvious that the thing must come east, and sooner rather than later. I take it they can't afford to delay too long before they deliver the goods. If we can stick it out here we must hit the trail. I've got another bit of evidence. I have solved Harry Bullivant's third puzzle. Sandy's eyes were very bright, and I had an audience on wires. Did you say that in the tale of Khazradin a woman is the ally of the Prophet? Yes, said Sandy. What of that? Only that the same thing is true of Greenmantle. I can give you her name. I fetched a piece of paper and a pencil from Blenkiron's desk and handed it to Sandy. Write down Harry Bullivant's third word. He promptly wrote down V.I. Then I told them of the other names Dumengadian had spoken. I told of my discovery as I lay on the woodman's cottage. The I is not the letter of the alphabet, but the numeral. The name is von Einem. Hilda von Einem. Good old Harry, said Sandy softly. He was a dashed clever chap. Hilda von Einem? Who and where is she? For if we find her, we have done the trick. Then Blenkiron spoke. I reckon I can put you wise on that, gentlemen, he said. I saw her no later than yesterday. She is a lovely lady. She happens also to be the owner of this house. Both Sandy and I began to laugh. It was too comic to have stumbled across Europe and lighted on the very headquarters of the puzzle we had set out to unriddle. But Blenkiron did not laugh. At the mention of Hilda von Einem he had suddenly become very solemn, and the sight of his face pulled me up short. I don't like it, gentlemen, he said. I would rather you had mentioned any other name on God's earth. I haven't been long in this city, but I've been long enough to size up the various political bosses. They haven't much to them. I reckon they wouldn't stand up against what we could show them in the United States. But I've met the Frau von Einem, and that lady's a very different proposition. The man that will understand her has got to take a bigger size in hats. Who is she? I asked. Why, that is just what I can't tell you. She was a great excavator of Babylonish and Hittite ruins, and she married a diplomat who went to glory 3 years back. It isn't what she has been, but what she is, and that's a mighty clever woman. Blenkiron's respect did not depress me. I felt as if at last we had got our job narrowed to a decent compass, for I had hated casting about in the dark. I asked where she lived. That I don't know, said Blenkiron. You won't find people unduly anxious to gratify your natural curiosity about Frau von Einem. I can find that out, said Sandy. That's the advantage of having a push like mine. Meantime, I've got to clear, for my day's work isn't finished. Dick, you and Peter must go to bed at once. Why? I asked in amazement. Sandy spoke like a medical adviser. Because I want your clothes, the things you've got on now. I'll take them off with me, and you'll never see them again. You have a queer taste in souvenirs, I said. Say rather the Turkish police. The current in the Bosphorus is pretty strong, and these sad relics of 2 misguided Dutchmen will be washed up tomorrow about Seraglio Point. In this game you must drop the curtain neat and pat at the end of each scene, if you don't want trouble later with the missing heir and the family lawyer. End of chapter 12.